Mesdames et Messieurs, bonsoir. Let me first let me thank my hosts from the French Parliament for inviting me here today, and also to say what a pleasure and honor it is to be with you and with Madame Rajavi and our friends from the PMOI and others. About 5 or 6 years ago, I became interested in the Iran resistance because I'm interested in the Middle East. And I learned a great deal about the resistance. And as I met members of the PMOI, each one was very eager to tell me their story, their personal story. Something happened in Iran to them, to their family members. They don't complain about the lost loved ones. They don't act like victims. And so in Washington, people don't understand what really happened under the Shah and under the mullahs. But by getting to know so many members of the exiled community, I began to see greater insights about the regime in Iran, which is very interesting to all of us. And I wanted to know, why would a regime engage in terrorism? Why would a regime engage in harsh internal repression? Why would a regime seek a nuclear weapons capability? Why would they be eager to come to the negotiating table and sit for 2 years with no agreement and smile and come back and delay for 2 years? Why would they be so interested in interfering with the politics of an Arab country next door, Iraq, and Yemen? Why? And so I studied these issues, and with the help of Iranian scholars, wrote about the answer to these questions to try to understand the regime. And I now understand when I hear Madame Rajavi speak about the regime acting out of weakness and vulnerability. I understand what this means in political development terms. I understand that the regime has a problem of legitimacy, because although Khomeini was welcomed when he came back from Paris, nobody knew about the constitution of Velayat Ifaqi until after. And when he tried to impose dictatorship on the people of Iran, they resisted and they said no. Finally, it broke into the streets in June of 1981, and this regime shot its way to power. So they are not legitimate. And the revolution which they suppressed has come back in 1999 and 2009. And I believe it will come back again. They are vulnerable because of the crimes that they have personally committed. In 1988, the Justice Minister, Pur Mohammadi, personally authorized the killings of tens of thousands of people, but so did other senior figures of the regime. The bombings in Argentina, the Mykonos killings of the Kurds in Germany. People are guilty of these crimes, and they have not been held accountable. And they're waiting to see if the Rome Statute or the International Criminal Court, The Hague, someday will make them answer for these crimes. They are vulnerable because they're acting against the interests of the Western world, the universal norms and laws and principles of France and the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. And of course, they established the model of a state trying to act as a broad religious authority for a wider region, a caliphate. This was the model that ISIS has followed. Iran set this model, and they have failed to run a proper state, and they have failed to run a caliphate. What President Obama did by focusing on arms control was to ignore all of the other things that the regime was doing, internally and externally. And many analysts in Washington excused this position by saying that there are reformists inside the government, under Rafsanjani, under Rouhani, Zarif. These are reasonable people, that they will improve Iran. And what we have seen time and again, when Rafsanjani was president, when Khatami was president, and when Rouhani was president, the repression internally goes up, not down. And so the reformist myth does not equal moderation. And so a number of prominent Americans, I don't call myself prominent, but many who have come to Paris again and again, who know the resistance very well, wrote a letter to President-elect Trump. It was delivered to the administration, and it was released 2 days ago. It was signed by 23 Americans whose name you recognize, and it explains the actual thesis of the vulnerability of the Iran regime and how its activities are inconsistent with the project that the West has for international law, for norms, for universal human rights, inconsistent with these very basic pillars of stability in the world, and cannot be reconciled. And the letter has attachments. It shows that for years, these same Americans and others have signed statements and delivered them in Villepin each summer, saying much the same thing. So this is not a new statement from Americans. This is a bipartisan statement that we believe that the U.S. policy should be broadened, improve and police the arms control terms, and tighten the loopholes and make sure Iran never builds a nuclear weapon. But pay attention to the destabilization of Iraq and Syria and Yemen. Pay attention to the horrific hangings and killings inside the country. And so the other major message of this letter is that the United States is being urged to have a dialogue with the National Council of Resistance of Iran. And maybe we can understand who the resistance is in America and how much they have stood bravely against dictatorship and for human rights, and trying to separate church and state, for tolerance, for women's rights. Madam Rajavi has had a 10-point plan for more than 10 years now. This is not a new plan. It was formalized 10 years ago. It was probably already represented their views long before that. So this is part of the message to the president-elect, which is now in the American media. The message to the new administration is, we're not trying to provoke war, which is what President Obama, in his message on Monday, said, we did the nuclear deal to avoid a war. Actually, there is another alternative, and that was the message of these signatories. It is, we don't promote war with Iran. We promote telling the truth and standing as a country for universal principles. If we do that, I think the Americans will be more in tune with our friends in France, the people of Iran, and the National Council of Resistance of Iran. Thank you.